Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much. How to Write Romantasy is available for pre-order right now, and you have the option to receive a free digital workbook that will help you craft a power couple that readers will devour. All the details are in the description. Get on it. On to today's topic. In honor of the upcoming release of How to Write Romantasy, I am interviewing popular romantasy authors so we can learn from them and see exactly how they achieved their success. And today we're talking to best-selling cozy fantasy and romantasy author Casey Blair. Casey Blair is a best-selling author of hopeful fantasy novels about ambitious women who dare, including Sage's Sanctuary, Tea Princess Chronicles, and Diamond Universe series. Her own adventures have included teaching English in rural Japan, taking a train to Tibet, rappelling down the waterfalls of Costa Rica, and practicing capoeira. She now lives in the Pacific Northwest and can be found dancing spontaneously, exploring forests around the world, or trapped under a cat. I can relate to that a little bit, but with a dog, right? Right. Casey is here today to answer all of your questions about one of the most popular subgenres of both fantasy and romantasy, the cozy subgenre. While these questions will be geared toward cozy romantasy, a lot of the advice pertains toward cozy fantasy in general and even other forms of cozy fiction, so we've got help for everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to get into this.
So let's start with the basics. How would you define cozy fantasy or cozy romantasy?
Like, I know this is the starter question and we have to start here, but this is also in a way kind of the most complex question because you'll hear so many disagreements. And that's true of any genre definition, right? Like nobody ever agrees, even if you're like, but my way is logical. Can't make everybody else agree. In my opinion, the defining feature of cozy is vibe, which is really hard to put your finger on, right? If you're talking about fantasy, there has to be a speculative element. If you're talking about romance, there has to be a happily ever after. But within the subgenres, there's a lot more overlap. Cozy fantasy is about vibe, it's about tone, it's about atmosphere, it's about mood. But there are some really common features that I think you have to hit because fundamentally, cozy fantasy is about ordinary people living ordinary lives and still having meaning. They're not about the king conquering the kingdom. They're not about like universe level government kind of stuff. That's not what we're doing here. It's also not about, big magical powers. People may have magical powers, but they're usually using them for like running a shop. But fundamentally, in cozy fantasy, ordinary characters, they want to meaningfully change their lives and the world, and they do. I actually like to contrast cozy fantasy with grimdark, which is another one that is just like totally on vibe. Like there's a difference between dark fantasy and grimdark, and it's the vibe. It's when you're really kind of like wallowing in that grittiness. But fundamentally in cozy fantasy, people want to change themselves and they can. And in grimdark, they may want to change themselves, but they can't. And that's like a narrative outlook choice. But cozy fantasy is so much about agency in your life and in the world, and the belief that a person... Oh, there goes my headphone. Cozy fantasy is about the belief that a person living in an everyday life can make a difference in a small way, and that those small ways can compound into being bigger. So if you help a person today, they may help somebody else tomorrow, and you'll assemble your found family of quirky characters, probably in a small town that's very charming, and together you'll be able to do bigger things than you'll be able to do on your own, but that only work because fundamentally you're paying attention to individual people at a local level. That's a really long answer, but basically cozy fantasy is about vibe. It's about ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives and still find happiness and meaning, and they're able to do that.
I love that you mentioned grimdark and how it's the opposite of cozy fantasy. I literally just interviewed a grimdark author. The total antithesis of what you just said. It was like,
yes,
everything is bad, and then anything they can do to make it worse, they make it worse. Whereas cozy is like,
we come together to make everything better.
I love that. And I love that you say it's all about vibes, because sometimes people ask me, I'm like, I don't write cozy, so I'm not the expert on this, but I'm always like, well, there's like a library, or there's a shop, or there's an inn, so it makes me feel a little bit better that I was like,
Well, I get authors sometimes who come to me and they're like, my readers are telling me this is cozy. Can you tell me if this is in fact cozy? And there's some confusion between like having a cozy feature and being the cozy genre.
Right.
And just like having characters drink tea in a cafe in one scene is not enough to make it cozy, right? It has to be cozy throughout. And likewise, being a comfort read is also not the same thing as being a genre marketing term, cozy fantasy, because many people will read grimdark as comfort reads. They are not cozy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some people are like, oh yeah, I find this like real, struggle and grit like so cozy, and like that's what I want to read when I'm curled up in front of the fire with my cat and I am cozy. And I'm like, that's not the same thing as cozy as a genre marketing term, right?
I'm one of those weirdos who I watch horror movies to relax. So it's like I would never be like, check out this cozy movie. It's Midsummer. So are there any key points or rules to keep in mind when writing cozy fantasy or romantasy that may be different to writing the standard romantasy novel?
Yes. I was on a panel last year with Sarah Beth Durst, and she was talking about the intro to her book, The Spell Shop. And one of the things she said that stuck with me, because her book starts in the middle of a revolution. Like, the building that the main character is in is burning down around them. Everything she wanted in her life literally burning, and she's having to like flee a revolution. But it still feels cozy. And one of the things she said was that kindness is one of the things that you have to start from the get-go to make it feel cozy, and I absolutely agree with that. There's often darkness in cozy, but fundamentally, as we were talking about before, your characters are trying to help people. They're trying to be nice. They're trying to be kind to each other in their interactions. They're not going into it trying to betray people, trying to get one over on somebody. They're not just in it for themselves. There is a fundamental kindness that is at the core of everything. And that's different than a lot of romantasy. Just because a lot of times the worlds are dark, or the romances themselves can be dark, depending on what kind of dynamic you have. If you're starting with an enemies to lovers dynamic, they're not necessarily trying to be nice to each other, right? That's not what you're doing, and that's fine. But cozy, there is an undercurrent of kindness from the get-go, so that even if something darker or more challenging or difficult comes up, you still believe that the characters are going to help each other, are going to get through this. You're establishing that tone right away, and you're keeping it consistent. This isn't like a bait and switch thing. And that's like a very fundamental narrative outlook thing that you have to start from the beginning, and you have to keep it going consistently through the book. For authors who are coming either from a fantasy background or from a romance background, there's a couple of other things that it's important to keep in mind with cozy romantasy. And the first is that in a fantasy, a lot of times we are solving problems with violence. We are solving problems with stabbing people, with magically punching them in the face. That's just not what you're doing in cozy fantasy. Which is not to say that there can't like ever be a fight scene or somebody getting punched, but like fundamentally that is not the ability that your character is using to solve the problems of the plot. And they may still be using magic, but it's not something that they are using to like physically and magically defeat somebody, you know? And that's like a big shift from like a lot of fantasy is very much reliant on violent encounters for addressing plot problems and for like solving the climax. You're solving problems fundamentally with bringing community together, because that is a thing that ordinary people can do to change our lives. And that's the like fantasy proposition of cozy fantasy. That's the fantasy that you're selling. And from romance, the thing to keep in mind is that the intimacy should be focusing on feeling seen and feeling safe. Like, not that you can't have lust, but like, again, since I mentioned enemies to lovers already, a lot of time with enemies to lovers, like there's an attraction even as they like hate each other. You can't do that in cozy fantasy. Before they start getting into intimacy, you're not gonna have sex scenes between your main characters before they like each other and before they feel safe with each other. You can't do that. I encounter this sometimes when people are like, you can't have spice in cozy fantasy. Of course you can have spice in cozy fantasy. Like, look at monster romance right now.
Right? Exactly.
There's so much, and it's more, and it's growing all the time. Even in those scenes, and even when you have like really high spice, you have to make sure that the intimacy is really about the characters, that they are able to reach new heights because of how safe they feel, because of how seen they feel. And that's really a focus. For both fantasy and romance writers who are coming to cozy romantasy, it's important to remember, because you're writing about ordinary people living ordinary lives, a lot more of your scenes are going to be spent with your two main characters doing ordinary things. It's not all just going to be like epic coming together after a battle. They're going to be like cooking together at home. They'll be sharing a story. You know, they'll be working together quietly in the library. You're gonna have a lot more of those cozy moments of tenderness and intimacy that are not big, like, world-breaking spectacle, either in the action sense or in the, like, action sense. And you can really, like, dial into the dialogue and the character development. We often use action scenes for moving the plot forward, and these scenes should still be moving the plot forward, but it's, again, your goal is about making connections, feeling seen, and healing. The focus on helping each other from the get-go is really going to shape, like, the tenor of how their romance develops.
This is just making me want to read more cozy fiction, because my preference for romance is when they feel safe and seen together. Like, I love a good enemies to romance every once in a while, but it's hard for me to get into the relationship when they're like hating, you know? And I'm like, you don't even like this person, you know? It's like, it's hard for me to get into it. So now I need to read more cozy stuff.
Well, and there is a lot of enemies to lovers, in fairness, that is like, by the time they do feel seen and they do feel connected and stuff. That's not like exclusive to cozy, but the difference is where that happens and how it starts and how it develops. You can do it differently in epic romantasy than in cozy romantasy. Like, you have to start with that kindness.
That makes sense. I need to update my TBR. Our next question was requested by one of my patrons over on Patreon, Sophie. One of the obvious benefits of cozy fiction is that the stakes are low, which means it's a light and fun read. But how do you keep the stakes low without making your world or story seem slow or boring?
This is another thing where I think there's a lot of like terminology confusion, actually, because if you look at the bestsellers in cozy fantasy, they are not low stakes. This is a really common misconception, but like in the spell shop, as I mentioned, like she's fleeing a revolution. Even in Legends and Lattes, which is like reasonably low stakes, there's a whole like mafia subplot. These are the cozy fantasies that sell best. They're not low stakes. All of these books have at some point threats of like life or death situations. And not all cozy fantasy has them, but like a lot of the bestsellers do. So the stakes don't necessarily have to be low, but they are local. And what I mean by that is that they're going to feel very important to your main character, but they're like, if the success of their bakery that they've been dreaming of for their entire life is under threat by like the local robber baron who's gentrifying the whole town, that's gonna feel really big to your character. I love A Rival Most Vile by R.K. Ashwick, where your main character is a potions master, and then a rival potions master comes to town and starts stealing his business, and he needed that business in order to meet this goal that he's been dreaming of and that he's put so much of himself into. That's what makes it feel really big. So the stakes are going to feel big even when it's not like the matter of like, will the kingdom crumble? Because it feels very personal. Part of the reason this works is because the fantasy of cozy fantasy is about ordinary people managing challenges in ordinary lives. So that's very relatable to those of us who are like trying to make our business succeed, right? And so the stakes are going to still feel very big. They're just local. There are also people who don't just say that they want low stakes, that they want no stakes, and like slice of life is already a thing and it exists, but it's not the same thing as cozy fantasy. So it really doesn't have to be low stakes, but it does have to be local stakes. It does have to be very, very personal. And I think that's one of the reasons that cozy fantasy and cozy romantasy is such a natural fit rather than just cozy fantasy, because in romance, the stakes are always very personal, right?
Right, that makes total sense. And this segues perfectly into the next question. I've seen a lot of debate about whether or not distressing topics like violence, racism, or misogyny are allowed in cozy fiction. What are your thoughts on this? And if they are allowed, to what degree should they be featured?
I think they are definitely allowed, and more to the point, I actually think that they're necessary. I mean, you don't have to have violence at all. You can write a book without them. And you certainly don't have to replicate like every injustice of our world. Like, by all means, write your queer normative cozy setting. Like, love that. But if you don't acknowledge that darkness exists in the world, then the character's healing isn't going to feel like it matters. because they're not healing from anything if there's no darkness in the world, right?
Right.
The way a narrative arc works is like character starts in a bad place, character ends in a good place, right? That's what makes it feel narratively satisfying. The difference isn't that darkness doesn't exist in cozy fantasy. The difference is that like you're really not wallowing in it, right? The focus is always on healing. It's always on kindness. It's always on helping people. It's always on finding your place and finding your happiness. Your character may encounter racism. It's probably more microaggressions than like physical violence,
Right.
which is not to say that microaggressions aren't really bad, but you're probably not going to be focused on them. Your characters are probably going to be supported in dealing with them and overcome. You're going to be seeing change in how able they are to be happy in their life and how they are triumphing over these things. Sometimes it's about, raising community awareness. You're definitely not dwelling in darkness, you're not wallowing in it, but there does have to be some acknowledgement that it exists, also just for like verisimilitude. Because again, the fantasy that cozy fantasy is selling is that an ordinary person can find happiness. And so in order for your reader to really feel that come home, they have to believe that your character is facing real challenges.
And I love that you mentioned that because there was a debate in my writing group recently where someone was like, this cozy fantasy is marketed as cozy, but it's not cozy because there's like a villain in it. And I'm like, well, all books have conflict. If it doesn't have a conflict, it doesn't have a plot. Like, it's, what do you expect? Like,
exactly.
there's gotta be something. I've read and I'm not the cozy expert, so correct me if I'm wrong. For example, if I read like a regular epic romantasy novel and there's kidnapping, it's like there's a threat of danger. I might be killed.
Then when I read cozy romantasy, if I see a kidnapping, it's more like,
I'm a bounty hunter and I'm taking you to jail, and they have like witty banter, and it's more of that like, oh, you lousy sheriff.
Or it's just not going to dwell on the fear of it. You end the scene with somebody getting kidnapped. My friend Gabrielle Landy has these like fairy tale retellings. The first one is Once Upon an Apple, I think, that does this. And there's
That's so cute. Sorry.
right. Scene ends with person getting kidnapped. The next scene with her, she's already been kidnapped and she knows that she's going to be rescued, and she knows that help is coming and that she's more capable, and she's not scared because she knows that now she has a community. Mm-hmm. So you just kind of like, not that there's no stakes there, but you're not dwelling in the really like scary parts the way that you would in an epic fantasy.
I love that. Oh, this is like, just talking about it, it's like very warm and fuzzy. So are there any common pitfalls or mistakes writers should try to avoid when writing cozy fantasy?
Yes. I'm beginning to feel like I'm like beating this really hard, but I do think it's so important, which is that I think trying to avoid stakes is the biggest pitfall I'm seeing. And like really, truly, you do not have to make your cozy fantasy insipid. And likewise with darkness, like you can have darkness. And I talk to so many writers who are like, but a bad thing happens in my book. Can it still be cozy? Yes. Yes,
bad things happen in all books.
Yes. And again, like verisimilitude, the fantasy you're selling is an ordinary people dealing with real problems. If there's no threat to the bakery, then it doesn't matter when your bakery is a success. If you look at the sales of the cozy fantasy that sells the best, it has high stakes. Mm-hmm. It has darkness in it. Two other things I want to say is first about agency. There's a real danger sometimes in cozy that it feels like good things are just kind of happening to your characters. Hello, dog friend.
She's like, I want to hear more.
In romance, that agency is important because it's so much about centering women's desire and women's pleasure and what a woman actually wants. And in cozy, you can't just have the coziness happen to your character or it feels unearned. Right? It doesn't feel like they have done any work to heal. And so it doesn't matter and the reader won't care. So you really have to keep them driving the plot and the change in their life and in their relationships and in their community and in their purpose really baked into everything you do. The final thing, which we've also talked about a little bit already, is just that remember, for people who are coming either from a fantasy background or from a romance background, is that the coziness has to thread through everything. So for fantasy readers, remember, you can't solve your problems with violence. Romance writers, remember, you can't use lust as a shortcut to get your characters on the path to their romance. The coziness is going to start from the beginning. It's going to thread through the mood, the tone, the interactions, the choices your characters are making. It's not just a matter of saying, like, I'm putting my enemies in a cozy cottage together and giving them tea. Features are not enough to make it cozy. It has to be the fundamental outlook that underlies everything in your story. Those are, I think, the 3 big points. Don't be insipid. Remember that they have to create their healing themselves. It can't just happen to them. And that the coziness should thread through all parts of your book. Don't have a checklist of features of like, I need to have a fantasy shop and I need to have a scene in a cottage and they need to drink tea and they need to eat baked goods. Yes, there are some common tropes, but like a checklist isn't going to make it cozy. The narrative outlook is going to make it cozy.
I love that. That is super helpful. So thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about all this. If you
Of
can't tell.
course. This was so informative because this is one of the subgenres that I don't know as much about. So I'm just like eating it up. I'm just like, yes, tell me more. Do you have any projects in the works and where can everyone find you online?
So right now, my Kickstarter is live for a book called The Quiet Light. This is the first in a brand new cozy fantasy romance trilogy. If you love cozy fantasy romance with spice, if you love dragons and shapeshifters and mate bonds, if you love ice cream, if you love ice cream, because you're gonna want to eat a lot of ice cream reading this book. And if you want books where people are helping each other and making a difference, this is for you. I actually have already done a prequel. So this is what the prequel looks like.
Oh yes, I've seen that all over the place.
The prequel is a standalone. It's set 500 years before the main trilogy, but it does introduce you to the main male character, rather, who is the dragon shifter. And the story picks up 500 years later when the most powerful human alive who's been in magical stasis for 500 years wakes up to help him. It's super cozy, it's super romantic, and I'm having a ton of fun with it. So that is the first book of the Sage's Sanctuary trilogy called The Quiet Light, which is live on Kickstarter now. My other series, this is what Tea Princess Chronicles looks like, and that's my best-selling cozy fantasy series if you want to check that out. On Instagram, I'm at Casey L. Blair. On Blue Sky, I'm at caseyblair.bisky.social, whatever that ending is. And my website, caseyblair.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter and get free short stories in a lot of my different worlds, including some that will introduce you to those worlds if you haven't read them before.
Awesome. And I will have as many links as possible linked below. Everyone, check out Casey Blair. Check out all of her goodies. This is so exciting. I'm super excited for the Kickstarter.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to get to talk to everybody about cozy fantasy. As you can tell, like, this is a subject I'm like...
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for joining us. So that's all I got for you today. How to Write Romantasy comes out in October, so if you're trying to write your very own fantasy romance novel, pre-order it today. Even better, if you pre-order, you can receive a bonus digital workbook. All you have to do is submit your proof of purchase. I've got the details in the description below. You can also check out my first writing craft book, Shut Up and Write the Book, or you can check out the first 2 books in my award-winning Romantasy series, The Savior's Champion and The Savior's Sister. They're linked below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Wednesdays and I host live streams on Mondays. And if you want to be alerted as soon as I upload, ring that bell. Bye! Have you subscribed to my channel yet? I mean, you totally should. I post new videos on Wednesdays. I also host live streams on Mondays and they're super fun. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel and be sure to ring that bell. That way you're alerted as soon as I post new content.